Hello and welcome to Masking for It, a podcast with a purpose, combining clinical insight with lived experience. Join us as we explore the realities of high-masking neurodivergent adults, debunk myths around autism and ADHD, and challenge outdated and harmful systems as we discuss the ways we can help neurodivergent people not just survive, but thrive. We're here so that the hidden can feel seen, the confused can find clarity, and the future can be different, because it needs to be. You can help us massively by following or subscribing, and in return, we can continue to bring you along behind the scenes with expert guests, pioneering research, and the chance to say you were a part of the change that we're creating. So, let's do this. Hello and welcome to our Halloween special, where we are going to be talking all things witches and witchcraft and why that still matters today, and the themes which run through it to do with women, equality, and just being that little bit different in society, but how that's nothing new. And we're going to look at how that's been dealt with before, see if there are any lessons we can learn from that, and to celebrate difference as well, and celebrate some things about those incredible women who sadly lost their lives. So how is everybody this week, first off?
Doing good. I escaped Morrison's this morning. I feel like it's becoming a theme that I go to a shop and then have to escape in a hurry to get back.
Maybe saves you a bit of money.
Yeah, true.
We're ready with our witch's brews, aren't we, as well?
Oh, yeah.
I ran out of time to get my witch's brew, so I'll go and conjure one afterwards.
You Gail's got our pumpkins as well.
I got my pumpkins for a all homegrown.
They really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. You are in the
Yeah.
garden a lot, doing all sorts of things.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the happy place to be.
I like that.
I still have sunflowers flowering as well.
They're still flowering.
Yeah. There's two slightly bedraggled, but still going strong. Yeah.
So nearly in November. They must have been very well looked after.
Neglected, I think.
How are you, Lesley?
Yeah, good, thank you. Still got a cat farm going on here. So I've not got a black one though. So unfortunately can't bring it into the conversation.
I was going to say that's very on theme, but I think, we can go with different cats. We're all about diversity.
We've got a black and white one, a black and white dog as well. So maybe that could be the new witching equipment.
I love your little ginger cat. That's what I'd have.
Yeah, it is very cute.
So where do we want to kick off from today? Because there's so much to cover with this one. And I don't know, it might be on some people's radar. It might not be on some people's at all and just think, what are they talking about? But maybe it's a good place to start with the history that's actually behind all of this, real events that unfolded, that go beyond sort of the Salem witch trials over in America, I think are the most famous, aren't they? But we've got immense history in this country, which really, really intensified around the time of King James up in Scotland when he started taking over England. And he needed to get everybody very much under control, and religion, rightly or wrongly, was absolutely a method of that, and making everybody behave properly. And this aspect was following an encounter he had and then wrote a book about, where he supposedly met some witches and was attacked by them. And so he sort of ended up having a real obsession, which then transformed into the Witchcraft Act. And from there, it really ramps up everybody looking at each other, being suspicious of each other, and it being able to become a legal matter going through the courts. So actually, we've got lots of it registered really well, of different accounts and what people thought in that time made somebody a witch, and the fact that we know women died due to being different. And I think that's why we see it a lot. And as an autistic, an ADHD, woman, I, feel that a lot as well. Because you look at these women, they often had, a lot of knowledge and interests and talents. And it was anything that made them stick out, whether they were really beautiful and the women in the town didn't like it, thought that they were bewitching their husbands to fall in love with them, or whether they were a spinster and people just didn't understand, well, why haven't you got married and had children? So it's to do with that othering that we speak about now, but it actually is a time in history where there are some very characteristic things of neurodivergence, but also it's just both scary and amazing to see how it all transpired through legal mechanisms. And the basis of a lot of that was that it was that allegiance with the devil, associated with witchcraft, and that's where King James really went to town on getting rid of it and expelling it and making it punishable by death. So
Yeah, and I think it's a bit of a myth that witches were kind of almost, and now we enjoy witches and images of witches with Halloween. And the story that people often tell about witches is that they were dunked in water, and if they survived, then they must have been witches. And if they died, then they weren't witches, but never mind, they were dead anyway. And it's kind of a shorthand for the whole 300-year period, slightly more really, of that systematic abuse of women and some men who were different. And I think perhaps the thing that really set it off was Kramer's book in 1486, Malleus Maleficarum, which kind of described how witches existed and what to look for. And it's absolutely shocking what's written in there about women cavorting with the devil and describing lots of aspects of women that we would probably now, in hindsight, you think, well, some of those could have been signs that people were neurodivergent in the community, and some of the signs that perhaps women were more susceptible to being targeted or to being looked at, and sort of developing this collective fear around women and scapegoating women who were a bit different or a bit peculiar. And then people being really frightened of them, and it was women usually who had particular skills, but it was also women who weren't really following the typical expectation of what females should behave like. Maybe women who were a bit isolated or particular skills around childbirth, and then using confirmation bias to then generate evidence that they were able to cast spells on other people. So if somebody's child died, for example, or there was an accident, and then there'd be that idea in the community that that particular person who'd been involved in it must have been a witch then, and they must have had certain powers and caused it. And then people were galloping around on horses, actively trying to seek out witches in communities and looking for people where there were stories about that, and then taking them away. And I think then women and men were outing people and saying, well, they're a bit unusual, they must be a witch, or they've done something, and guess what, somebody crashed the cart, so they must have done that because they touched it the day before. So lots of systematic, active seeking out and othering people, which is exactly what happens to neurodivergent people in our society today. And I don't think it's a step too far to look back and think those people were highly likely, or many of them, many women and some men, were highly likely to have been neurodivergent themselves.
Mm-hmm. I know the accounts where it does mention some men being convicted. I don't think the men were killed, interestingly, but some men were identified as practicing witchcraft. And that was generally in the fields of science. So there's a lot around it where people are celebrated. And again, this is the difference, isn't it? Celebrated doctors to begin with as men at that time. But then as soon as something goes wrong, or as soon as there was a sort of political reason for it not to be celebrated, that was the easiest thing to throw. And it seems really outlandish to think of it that way now. But back in a time where knowledge was so limited, it was their mechanism to explain anything that they didn't have an explanation for. It was sort of, it's either magic or it's by the power of God. And I think that's probably that human thing, isn't it, of wanting to know why and not liking something that they can't understand. And that applies to both these people in society back then labelled as witches and people now who are neurodivergent, again, not understood, essentially. So it's sort of the psychology of fear around those things. Does that sound like something psychologically makes sense, actually?
Yeah, and I suppose it's a very extreme example of people being dismissed for being other and being different. And I'm sure we can all think of examples from today of people, because they have a label of neurodivergence of one sort or another, that they're dismissed because of their difference and their different way of communicating maybe, or their different way of behaving or interacting with somebody, that because of that label, they're dismissed. And back in those times, it wasn't sufficient just to dismiss somebody. It was taken to the absolute extreme where those people were exterminated because people could not cope with the idea that somebody had the talents or abilities or power that challenged, the natural order of things as it had been established.
Yeah. And that makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense when you're a new king that's come into power in a country where they'd have seen you as potentially an enemy before, and you want to get order real quick, and you want people obeying you, and you don't want independent thinkers.
Yeah, and I suppose that fear of difference and needing conformity, it still operates now, because that kind of that stigma towards people with mental health difficulties or disabilities, it kind of that sense of moral panic almost of these people are really scary. And you see it in the news all the time about people, and it's not just about neurodiversity, it's about ethnicity as well, and other forms of oppression to minority groups. So I think, the only reason we're focusing in particular today on neurodivergence is that that's what we talk about in our podcast. I suppose there's something about how, today, if you look at the news, there's a lot of conversations about if something really bad happens, if the conversation is that, well, they were mentally ill or they were autistic, people go, oh yeah, of course they were. So it means, it portrays that unspoken kind of inferred message that people who are mentally unwell or people who are neurodivergent can be dangerous, and you've got to watch out for them. And it's actually very often, if you look at the life histories of the people who've done these things that are reportable in the media, these violent acts, it's not necessarily because they're autistic on its own. It's because of what's happened to them as a result of being othered or being traumatized by a society that they live in. I think sometimes the label itself, it then just perpetuates more of that othering in exactly the same way as the moral panic around the witches that was going on in societies, and it being whipped up because if people knew the witch hunters were coming, then start looking around them and saying, well, who's weird, who's different? And I don't want it to be me, so it's got to be you. And I think that's something that happens in schools a lot as well, in terms of, we were talking last time about comparative psychology and packs and how animals interact with each other. I was sitting outside a high school yesterday and I just thought, we are animals. And if you look at how like massive groups of people behave, you can see different packs within a setting where there's lots of people brought together who might not otherwise have anything to do with each other in their lives. And schools are really unusual situations where loads of people of the same age are brought together in a really very, very unnatural environment. And I think I hear a lot about, when we're in school meetings, people saying, well, how are they going to manage in real life if they can't manage school? And actually, that's the only time in your life you ever put in a situation where people are behaving with pack mentality. And the othering happens within a school year. And I think we could probably all look back at our school days and we could name or remember people now and the hierarchy of the different packs within our school systems, who you mess with, who you don't, who was othered. And looking back now, I can think of loads of people who were othered in my school year who for sure were neurodivergent, but were not identified as that because that wasn't even a name for it then anyway. So, it's very similar, that moral panic, because you don't want to be associated with the people who are picked on because that makes you a target as well.
And that would have been amplified in the way that it kind of is within a year group at school. That would have been amplified back in small towns or things, as society was then. It would have been much more insular and hierarchical and more of a pack. Your town was your pack in a way. And it was life or death, essentially. But what fascinates me about this topic is what things were picked up on as dangerous or scary and making someone different. There were literally items listed such as hairbrush or broom, of course, we associate with witch, frying pan, like normal household items, pieces of jewellery were, even gold and silver were on the list in some of the laws made. Possession of those counted against you as being a witch. They made it so broad of what could count to nailing your identity, basically, and giving them free rein. It's not as though they were horrendous crimes as we can hear about now. There are very simple things going on. But again, they didn't necessarily have explanations. And I think as well, that being different and that neurodivergent mind, I think, we see, so some of the men, as I mentioned, were scientists, were doctors, but how that transpired in women, and again, why there's this mirroring of neurodivergence, is that they were people who were exceptionally skilled in things which we would now call science and creativity, or a natural way with animals, lots of these different things, being a cook. But obviously, you can see how all of those things can easily lead into situations that go wrong. And eventually it became, we have the medicine woman, and, she'd have all her tinctures and bits and bobs, and she was eventually celebrated. But until then, I think these women had that amazing knowledge that we can build up with our encyclopedia minds of different herbs and things that helped as remedies and knew how to put them together and could help with healing. And that was all fine as long as it went well. But, that and cooking both had the potential for someone to fall ill as a result of, or have an allergy or things like that. The affiliation with animals as well. If there was an outbreak of foot and mouth or something between the animals, well, if there was someone who cared for the animals or lived next to them and would look after them, go over and see them, it was just too easy for that connection to be made. But actually, underneath those things are lots of innate qualities that we have and talents that we have because of that lack of synaptic pruning. We just build up knowledge about things, and that can make you revered until it potentially went wrong or didn't suit other people in society.
Yeah. And I think it'd been people who behaved differently or particularly didn't conform to the social norms as well. People who have, I suppose the idea was women were expected to marry, have children, behave themselves. And women who didn't conform socially might have been a bit reclusive or a bit outspoken, didn't follow those gender norms, as well as the work they might have done. But very often they would have lived alone, been widowed, been really poor, and they would have lacked the social protection around them. So when those accusations did come, they were already really, really vulnerable because they didn't have people around them to be able to say, no, they're part of our pack, actually, they're fine. Very often were isolated. And if we think about, they didn't have any understanding of neurodivergence then. So people who seem socially unusual would have been, possibly emotionally detached, very, very focused on what they were doing, resistant to authority. They might have been viewed as suspicious or unnatural. Then now people who we might celebrate as being, amazing activists, people like Greta Thunberg, or you just think, well, stand up and just go, no, this is not okay. At that point, we're being kept firmly under the thumb by the fear that they would be called a witch.
And I think it goes with, Greta's probably a great example, actually, of, that fierce independence and strength of our thinking, that huge sense of justice, and fighting for what we believe in. So Joan of Arc, again, comes to mind. But that's a threat, and that's especially what men particularly wouldn't have enjoyed back then. And if you think even of words we have now, so hysterectomy, so that comes from hystera in Greek, which is obviously the root of the word hysteria, which is an extreme or exaggerated, uncontrollable emotional outbursts, or state of being. Why is that word hysteria to describe something so out of control and irrational and crazy, really, isn't it? Rooted in women, our uterus. That is what that word comes from. And I think that says so much to back up sort of where minds were back then, and how things were described, and how things women had to deal with weren't taken seriously. If you weren't being a good wife or conforming and being polite and soft, but then you think how outspoken we are, how maybe even just missing social cues, we might not have been quite as polite as we needed to be. That was really dangerous then, actually dangerous. But, part of it's just a woman's spirit, and then part of it is neurodivergence. Any of those cases apply, but you can see how negatively that was all interpreted, not only with the hangings and things like that, but even language. It sits in there. It's evidence there.
Yeah, and it still leaks into language today, doesn't it? Because if you think about the DSM that we were talking about last time, and some of the ways that women are described as being sexually immoral, or some men are described as sexually deviant. That language is still around. People still say you're a witch, meaning you're not a very nice person. I think I've used that word this week actually about certain people that I know. We use it very fluidly and very naturally without really thinking of that deeper psychological process of othering. And I think that really applies to autistic women in particular, and neurodivergent women in particular, because you've got the bit that's about being different, but there's also something about being female and different that is particularly dangerous, or particularly, what's the word, systematic, what's the word, Gail?
Systemised.
Systemised, that's it. I've asked the speech therapist for a word. She's got loads of words in her head. Systemised, because, I suppose it was religiously and legally justified by the fact that it then became in law. And I think, we were talking before about things being in the DSM that are now not, things that are in law now, that in the future there is potential to change the law and to change the systems. And just because things are the way they are now, and that there are laws for certain things, there are ways that we have set up in society around schools, around special needs education, about mental health, about the way women are treated, and we've still got the gender pay gap and all of those things, doesn't mean it's stuck forever. And we have to start having conversations and naming it. And I guess that's why we're doing this pod, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's something for me that there's all the stuff around the innovation and how that's perceived and the threat that potentially causes. But there's also something about deliberately practicing witchcraft that actually makes sense when you think about it in terms of the ritual, the routine, the connection around a very specific topic, or having social connection with others that isn't reliant on small talk and all those things, that there's a structure and there's a hierarchy and there's an understanding of each other's roles within that you can see how that helps people to form their identity and naturally leads into neurodivergent strengths and ways of being and ways of relating to other people that that kind of really makes sense. I think I listened to a podcast on the BBC by India Rakison called Witch, and she explores in lots of different areas about witchcraft, and there's a particular episode where they talk about that kind of the scientific evidence that being engaged in ritualized language and ritualized behaviors has a positive impact on people's well-being. And I can really see how that is emphasized in people who are neurodivergent because of the links and the natural ways that people's brains work.
And how important
absolutely.
that coven aspect would be, especially if you were othered in your village, in your town, finding your coven and your other people who shared the same interests, who you were safe to be yourself with, who you could celebrate the same things with and share your knowledge with, that would have meant everything. And been a lifeline for you, really, and your well-being. So that does make a lot of sense, coming together. And because I think even now, I find it quite hard to get on with women overall. I'm I don't know. You find your women that you can get on with easily, and you find your women that you don't, basically. And I think all women have a slight sense of that. We all have our different types that we're okay with, and we have our types I find difficult. And actually, that's why I spent a lot of time with the boys at school, or it was just easier somehow. I think, whether it's epigenetics, it's been carried down. I've heard it spoken about before, that sort of suspicion between women that's carried on and a bit ingrained between all of us, because although there shouldn't be competition, and I suppose maybe that's why I don't massively fit with normal women, because I don't really have that. There shouldn't be that sort of competition between each other. We should be lifting each other up and supporting each other, and your friends' win is a win for you, and all of those sorts of things. I think that's something that women still struggle with, is there's this slight suspicion, because back then, if you weren't fitting in, if you weren't doing the right things, it wasn't just you're going to be excluded from the group. It was you might end up dead. And so there were cases where it was jealousy about a woman's looks or things like that. I think it still had a massive impression on how women communicate with each other. And in some ways, that's really positive, because for me, I probably do work more on a coven basis. I have a few friends I really deeply trust and am close with and share everything with, and we'll love each other to pieces and celebrate things. It's more a sort of quality over quantity situation. But there's not one that's right or wrong. It's got to be whichever suits you. But it's just those ways of differing, isn't it? And there needing to be room for all of them. And I think what's different now as well, which is really good, is we're all starting to learn about not being in toxic friendships and having to pander to everything. We're learning more about looking after yourself and having boundaries and things like that, which is really healthy. But I think it's also stepping into your individuality. And there's some fantastic accounts on Instagram and stuff with people practicing witchcraft in a modern way, or bringing through the elder traditions. And it's something that's really celebrated now, to have that knowledge, to have that intuition, to have those senses. And no one will ever know what does or doesn't work, because I think psychologically these things help as much as whatever your religion is or spirituality. It's about having something that makes things make sense and helps your well-being, as you say, Gail, and gives you an identity as well. But, you know, all those little talents, I think anyone takes it as compliment now, of, you know, having that niche little knowledge about these different things. And who's to say it doesn't work? It's magic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think like thinking about the future, you know, you would hope that as people have accepted witchcraft as a positive thing, that is something that can bring a lot into people's lives and can contribute to society and our understanding of the way the world works, that we want to be in a place where that narrative's flipped for neurodivergence as well, don't we? That that it's recognised for the talents and the things that it brings into the world, and it isn't that focus on the negative aspects or the negative impacts on systems and society that have only come about because society is set up in a way that doesn't enable people. It suppresses people and makes their life difficult.
I suppose actually it really,
Yeah.
really shows we haven't made the progress we've needed to, have we, with who we treat differently and how we treat difference. We're still not understanding it. We're still not accepting it. We're still not making room for it. So I suppose that's our biggest bit of work we've got to do in society, is start understanding that and celebrating those
And
things.
that doesn't cost any money, does it? It does not cost money to
No.
have empathy, show kindness, listen to what people are saying. I think increasingly in speech and language therapy, we're talking a lot more about supporting people to self-advocate. But there's a risk to that for people, isn't there? Disclosing a diagnosis or saying that you need things to be done differently. And that we can give people all the skills in the world to be able to do that. But if the person they are speaking to or the system that they're interacting with can't hear that, they're not open to listening and accepting what that person's saying as the truth, then we're in a bit of a situation, aren't we? And that actually, if the systems and the people in those systems would be open to listening and show some kindness, then it wouldn't cost that system any more money, would it? It would just make everybody's life better.
I think that extends to services more widely in terms of physical health as well, because we know that severe, like chronic stress and being ostracised can trigger biological responses in your body. And if you think about epigenetics as well, the people in our families who maybe have been stigmatised or experienced trauma, that then leaves a genetic marker that impacts people, you know, future generations. That's what epigenetics is. And if we think about heightened stress sensitivity, then not only maybe people who are neurodivergent experience, and then that impacts upon the physical health, but we're thinking about our ancestors and their stress that impacts upon our tendency to experience stress and anxiety and the impact on the body. There's not really enough understanding of how that then leads to certain physical conditions that neurodivergent people experience a lot more than neurotypical people. And that, I suppose, the understanding is not just about our mental well-being, but it's about our physical well-being as well, and what that means in terms of stress and trauma and the impact of the world. And I think we go back to that a lot in our discussions, don't we? It's not necessarily being neurodivergent in itself that is difficult. It's the impact of other people and the environment on people's well-being and living in that world that's not set up. And as you just said, Gail, that's something about just kindness can impact upon someone's day massively and reduce the stress. And there are things that we can all do with each other to make that happen. And I suppose if we think about the message around women being suspicious of other women, that internalized misogyny has an impact upon our ability to be kind to other women, whether it's women or from men. And I suppose it's about kindness and nurture.
Yeah, well, we can all do it. We're all capable of it. It's just got to happen. But again, it's that understanding, with understanding and kindness, which some of those women could have done with. But I think they're an amazing example, and it's horrific what they had to go through. But I think we need to honour their part of history that they played and what they show us about difference, and that we can't keep persecuting it because we know we got it wrong. We know now we got it wrong. So let's not be having the same conversation again and start celebrating some of those differences. That is all for today. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope you come back next time. Please follow or subscribe so that you don't miss a thing. And if you'd like even more of us, you can go over to www.maskingforit.com and find more episodes and blogs on our website, which get into some nitty-gritty detail because we do love that. And you can also get in touch with us if there's something that we haven't covered, or you have any questions or something about your experience that you'd like to share. Then please send that to us via email. It's contact@maskingforit.com, or any of our socials, which are @maskingforitpodcast. We'd love to hear from you, and thank you so much for being here as we bring the conversation out to the real big world to see if we can change it just that little bit. Thank you so much for being a part of it, and we'll see you next time.